Good morning, Commissioner.
Good morning. Great to see you again.
Likewise. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for hosting this hearing.
My pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for being here. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Well, why don't I go ahead and get started? So very pleased to be here with my very good friend, Robert C. We've worked together very closely on a number of projects, really, I think, a great example of federal and state partnerships. And really wanted to thank you for your leadership, Assemblymember Wood, and looking forward to working with you to help to close the digital divide, particularly in rural areas, but also very glad that you mentioned as well the digital divide in urban areas. So just a couple of things, as we talked about at the last hearing. Really, the digital divide, I think, is characterized by two main flavors, and you don't get to the second without the first. The first is about access, and that's what the chart showed by Mr. Ort, was the gaps in access and the place that really just don't have the access to the internet backbone, to the fat pipes, to the fiber. And this is certainly consistent with the visits that we've had in conjunction with proceedings. Since I last saw you, the CPUC has approved the transfer of all of Verizon's wireline assets to Frontier. And as part of that, we visited 11 different communities in rural regions, including some in your regions, and saw many communities that don't have broadband. They only had internet of 1.5 megabits per second down, 768 up. And so it just was insufficient to support a lot of what are now very basic modern applications or essential things like the SCADA system to run a water utility system, which really creates all sorts of problems with drinking water, fire danger, et cetera, let alone being able to do telehealth education, et cetera. And then there are places that have just total gaps and have nothing. And in some cases, not even good phone service. In some places, not even electrical service. So there really is an access problem. And then in the cities, that access problem manifests itself in places like housing developments that are either state funded or federally funded, publicly funded housing developments that either don't have the wiring brought up to them or don't have the inside wiring. Now, we are trying to address that one in part through the program that was passed by the legislature a couple of years ago with regard to the broadband public housing account. And I brought along, and there are copies on the table, I believe you have one. You had asked us about broadband funding as well as distribution. So this is a list of some of the major broadband funding programs. And so the broadband public housing account is one of our newest programs. We have had a number of application rounds, and there's a great deal of interest in this. I can tell you right now that so $25 million was allocated for this. We definitely anticipate running out of the money within a fairly short order by 2016, I believe it's projected. And so I know that there is interest in putting more money into this account. I believe this is money very well spent. I would add that I met with Secretary Castro, the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, last week, along with Sonny Wright McPeak, who's the Executive Director of the California Emerging Technology Fund, and also former Assemblymember Bradford, who was the author of AB 1299. So one of the things that we talked about was just the opportunities to really bring broadband to public housing, and particularly to try to coordinate this with efforts to bring more energy efficiency to public housing. So the CPUC has a number of programs that we administer under the Energy Savings Assistance Program. There are also federal programs. And this, I think, is another example of just important opportunities to harness the synergy, similar to dig once, refurbish once, and address both the energy needs and the broadband needs at the same time, which would really be transformative for the people living in the public housing, as well as for the agencies that are spending money on it. And Secretary Castro said that the energy bill was a very large bill for HUD, on the order of over $6 billion a year. And so if they were able to make these buildings more energy efficient, that would certainly bring lots of benefits. So we have access issues, right? And then as well as neighborhoods, even in urban areas that are not as well deployed, where you really have gaps, where neighborhoods like my old neighborhood in East LA, when I looked at the NTIA map a few weeks ago, there wasn't a choice available even of 10 megabits per second in my old neighborhood in East LA. The second flavor is really about adoption and affordability. And so we have a number of programs that are addressed to help to address affordability, including Lifeline. One of the things that we're finding about Lifeline in the rural areas is, again, this becomes limited by access. There are plenty of places where people would love to have mobile phones, but the problem is you just don't have the backhaul built there to enable the mobile phones. So we've tried to address these things through a number of programs. One of the things that we're very excited about is, in addition to our state programs, the California High Cost A Fund, which helps to support the 13 small rural incumbent carriers, and they are doing a good job. And we last year in our decision agreed that where they were using the money for network build out that could support both voice and broadband, that it's one integrated network, that they could use the money to support that. And we have seen very good deployment in particularly the areas served by the small incumbent rural carriers. We also have the California High Cost B Fund, which supports the larger carriers, AT&T, now Frontier, formerly Verizon California, as well as SureWest, which is Consolidated Communications. So we actually anticipate receiving more applications into that fund, particularly from Frontier, as Frontier is looking for ways to leverage the build out of its network. We also are going to be deploying, and really I think this is a game-changing opportunity for California, the Connect America Fund money that is now going to be leveraged by our approval last week of the transfer of Verizon to Frontier. So one of the conditions that Verizon had imposed on their acceptance of the approximately $230 million in federal money was that we approve this transaction by December 31st, and we approved it a couple of weeks ago. So with that, AT&T is going to be getting approximately $360 million over the next 6 years, and Frontier to approximately $230 million in federal funds. And their charge is to deploy broadband networks in rural areas. They'll be looking at the census blocks that the FCC has identified as underserved, and they are charged with the obligation of building to households, every household in that area, of at least 10 megabits per second down and 1 up, although they may also build to institutions along the way. Do you have a question?
I do, actually I do, and thank you. And if you don't mind, I do. So going back to that 10, because and I am, it's, you talk about an alphabet soup of things, dealing with any of you guys, no pun intended, guys and gals, but it is challenging. So I'm going to go back to, you said the Connect America funding, federal funding, correct? What kind of oversight do we have in California to ensure that is being done in coordination with our policies and our goals in California? Because quite frankly, 10 megabits per second doesn't sound like a very robust network.
No, it's not very high. And so this is the standard that the FCC picked. And so this is the minimum that they have set. Now, what some of the carriers, such as Frontier, have told us in our proceeding on the Verizon Frontier transaction is that because the standard is you have to give the farthest household in the eligible census block 10 megabits per second down and 1 up, that for those who are closer to the central offices and the facilities that will feed everything, they will likely get a much higher standard. So that's what they anticipate. But the federal standard, which the FCC set, said 10-1. So I don't think that there's a lot that we can adjust on that standard because it's their money. We commented, frankly, a few years ago on all of that, and this was decided in the previous year.
So we really don't have any oversight?
So I think on the question of what is the speed standard, that's already been decided by the feds. But I think where we do really have an oversight opportunity, and indeed we have already begun this dialogue, and I think the legislature's involvement in this dialogue would be fantastic, would be in discussing the deployment and where the build is going to happen when, and what are some of the priorities in the build. So in fact, Robert C. was at the meeting that we convened in conjunction with the Broadband council on October 30th, where we talked about in the CPUC's Water Energy Nexus proceeding, the Water Energy Communications Nexus, the importance of communications to helping us manage our water and energy resources, fight wildfire and the drought and all. And so we had representatives there from Caltrans, from the High Speed Rail Authority, from all of the electric utilities as well, who spoke about the importance, and as well from Frontier and AT&T. And so, and it was hosted at the Office of Emergency Services. So one of the things that we are planning is doing a follow-up meeting that, again, would be led by OES as well as some of the other emergency services to talk about, within the map of the areas where they're authorized to build, where are priorities as we look at our state priorities in terms of emergency, wildfire, all sorts of problems, where would we like them to build first? And so there is, within the FCC rule, a rule that 40% of the eligible households have to have the build-out done by 2017. So the reality is that the network planning is already commencing. And so really now is the time, now through early 2016, to have this discussion about what do we think as a state level is important to build. And so, I believe that in some of our proceedings at the CPUC, for example, through the Water Energy Nexus, because we made the incumbent local exchange carriers and the rural carriers respondents in that proceeding, that we may be able to look at some orders that would be relevant to achieving those objectives. I think that this would also be a terrific topic for this committee, would be to talk about the build out and state priorities.
Yeah, I guess 10 megabits per second. I think of what I have at my house right now, and it's supposedly 50, I guess, or whatever. I don't know. I pull my hair out half the time because it can still be bogged down and be so terribly slow. So 10, I might be suicidal at that point.
We hope not.
And so I'm a little frustrated. I guess extrapolating from that, what I would hate to see happen here is that carriers build this out. It's an inadequate system for the long run, because I just can't imagine that 10 megabits per second is going to be sufficient 10 years from now, 5 years from now, even maybe 3 years from now, and then use that as a tool to say, well, we can't do anything. We're not going to let anybody else come in because we can't, because it's already served. We're not going to. So I'm a little concerned about that.
I agree, and this is certainly a debate that the FCC has been having. So, I would be happy to have a conversation with our lawyers of, is there anything that could be done in terms of petitioning the FCC about, again, this is their proceeding and their money, but they've been pretty clear that at this point this is a standard they've chosen. However, nothing prevents the carriers from, in fact, building a more robust network. And I would suggest that the model that you just heard from the gentleman before us is really a great model that both Mr. Ord and Mr. Nelson have really built generational networks. And as you heard particularly from Mr. Ord, that network, it's a terabit network. It was really envisioned to support the needs of our communities on digital 395 and their connection with the world, not just now or even a year or 5 years from now, but to accommodate 10 years of growth and far beyond. So I think there's nothing in the federal rules that prevents them from doing that. And in fact, the reality is that, as was mentioned before, the real problem is a lot of your expenses are in your clearances, in your digging, and in your laying. So there are also some issues with regard to CEQA, that there's another CPUC proceeding, in fact, that we're looking at, because for a variety of reasons, historical reasons, AT&T and Verizon, or now be Frontier, hold these legacy franchises that are unwritten franchises that precede the CPUC Certificate of Public Convenience and Necessity process. And so the interpretation has been, because of these old franchises, that they are exempt from CEQA. So this has enabled certain carriers to be able to build much faster and at a lower cost because of the CEQA exemption. So we have a petition, we're looking at that proceeding because, as you heard, other carriers who are not in that category don't have the CEQA exemption. And so, but I think that because they do have this equal exemption, again, they could harness that ability to be able to do build out, and once you're digging, to be able to build out in a fast way. And while we're talking CEQA, so one of our partners in the Broadband Council is Caltrans. And so I think this is another opportunity. We've been discussing this with Caltrans. Sunny was the leader when Sunny was the secretary of the Business Transportation Housing Agency. I was her undersecretary for a bit. And so, Caltrans has been looking at this whole issue of a dig once policy for a long time. There's also been some precatory language that the legislature has adopted, but, we're at the point if I think that we need to just make a policy of the state to get Caltrans aligned. We're about to build several giant trenches with the High-Speed Rail Authority. My chief of staff and I met with the High-Speed Rail Authority. They are very interested in partnering with us to say now, as we're building the high-speed rail corridor, what can we do to really service the communications needs of all the towns along the way, the fields, agricultural areas, what can we do to also deal with the electrical needs and all of those issues. You want to really dig once. And the same for highways. We've been talking about this for 10 years. And so especially as we have this policy going through and really an unprecedented $550 million, this is the time to be able to really look at those issues. And I would add that for AT&T and Frontier also, that some of the networks, such as the ones that you heard about from Mr. Ord and Mr. Nelson, really can be partner networks where they can leverage them. So in fact, in the Verizon Frontier transaction, Frontier, as part of their proposal to the CPUC for approval of that transaction, entered into an agreement with Digital 395 to be able to use some of their backbone to support ultimately what Frontier is going to be doing as they deploy the federal money. So in closing, just want to call your attention to a couple of issues, if I may. So one is that I'm very glad that you mentioned Congressman Huffman's bill, H.R. 4160. Would love to work with you and the congressman on that. I'm very excited about the model of building on the Rural Electrification Administration. So one of the things that Mr. C and I have talked about is that I have often said that the Rural Electrification Administration is a great model, but what they did is they electrified the farmer's house. They brought electricity to the farmer's house, but they did not bring electricity to the farmer's field. And so this is one of the number one reasons why today you have a lot of wells that are run off of diesel generators. And so when you talk about pollution in the agricultural areas, diesel is a huge source of it, and it's not coming from the cities. It's coming from people who are using diesel because they don't have access to electricity. Now, under the CPUC's own rules, our rules try to get cost causers to pay for additional costs that they incur. So if you're trying to extend electricity, say if you were extending electricity from the curb to this building and we didn't have it here, you get an allowance. So the allowance in PG&E territory is about, as memory serves, about $2,500. So once you exceed that allowance to cover those costs, then you have to pay. And the cost for a mile, if you need to bring in electricity a mile, as often happens when you're trying to connect to a well, is $40,000 a mile. So the effect of this is that it's been unaffordable, although what has happened that as with the drought, we have seen many farmers finally decide that it is imperative for them and they'll pay the $40,000 because they need the electric power to be able to try to get the groundwater.
Wouldn't it seem logical that we could use some of our cap and trade money for projects like that?
Exactly. So that's one of the things that I would love to work with this committee on, because, and the reason I bring this up is that I would like to ask Congressman Huffman and also you if one of the things that you could put in this bill is money for electric access. There really is just a understudied connection between electric access and communication. You really have a difficulty having one without the other. One of the beauties of copper is that copper conducts electricity. Fiber is made out of glass. It doesn't conduct electricity. So as a result of that, you need to put more boosting things along the way. Now, for undersea cables, they accomplish this in part by wrapping things in copper and then having them undersea, but then you still need like boosters every 50 miles. But there are places like on the Yurok Reservation, north of your district, where there is an electrical gap. So there is a school, the Jack Norton Elementary School, that runs on diesel generators today. The poor, the kids, we're right next to diesel. It just breaks your heart. And, diesel, we have information. It gets in your DNA. It's just terrible. And so these are some schools where the kids have to be bused because there's not enough broadband to be able to take the Common Core tests. Well, you can't get broadband there. You can't do certain things with the voice network without the electricity. So the Yurok have recently got a quote from PG&E about how much it's going to cost to try to complete the electric project up there. They did a big extension and got some more electric lines in service so that parts of the reservation got electricity in June of 2013. Parts of the reservation near Wichpec got telephone service for the first time in April of 2014. But there's still a third of the reservation that has neither electricity nor telephone service. And so along with putting money into the telecom access, putting more money into the electric extension would be critical because, in fact, that electric extension that the Yurok got was funded by a CPUC program, the RTI, which expired. So that would be another great program that we had that we could also use some money for. If we had RTI again, that would be very helpful to be able to address these gaps. And there are odd gaps in lots of places in California. There's a gap in Siskiyou County. It's kind of on the way to Wairika, go Edna and turn around, and then there's a little town with a post office, and it's kind of near Forks of Salmon. So, and there's an electric access gap. But we see a lot of places on Native American reservations where you have electric access gaps, and then some places in the rural areas, and then definitely on farm fields. So I think that there are a lot of opportunities to really address the confluence of problems that we have that result in these gaps. And then the very last thing I'll say is that we also need to be attentive as we do all of this to look at service quality. And so we do have a number of CPUC proceedings. I've listed just some of them on this, including our proceeding looking at the service quality rulemaking, and we're also doing an audit. It was determined in the proceeding that the audit was needed, especially of AT&T's facilities and also Verizon's current facilities. We are going to be moving forward with our call completion proceeding. We have gathered some data on that proceeding, and there was some information provided at this last hearing. And so one of the next things that we'll be doing is having more public participation hearings and workshops. So we would love to coordinate with your office. We're planning tentatively a hearing in Ukiah, since it is a county seat in Mendocino, and would love to coordinate to have you be there. We also picked Ukiah because we know that there have been a lot of problems with fiber cuts in Mendocino, definitely likely holding a hearing in Copperopolis and other areas. And then we also have a order instituting investigation on competition, really looking at about 10 years ago, the CPUC adopted a number of proceedings where the CPUC basically assumed that competition would be sufficient to provide robust service everywhere. And so we're just gathering data to really test how has that theory worked itself out. And in particular, did that theory really prove itself out everywhere? Are the rural areas just the same? Has competition been just as effective there as it has been in some of the cities? Or are there other things that we need to do to get to, as you say, that robust level of service that's going to serve us not just for the year or provide us with, last year's standards, but is going to serve us for our generation and really help our economy and safety.
And first of all, thank you very much. Really appreciate you being here. I know you have a time constraint, but I want to ask you one question because it was a question I asked David and Michael is one set of standards. How do we get that to happen? How do we get a single set of standards for deployment around broadband statewide? Where do we go?
So I think, again, this is about identifying what some of the barriers are. So I think definitely we have heard over and over again that dig once is one of the barriers. So I think we can look at we're at the point, I think, where we need to look at if you make it a state law that Caltrans has to do certain things and, set some time limits, then that's something that we can do, right? And then also try to create a level playing field. I'm very intrigued by the idea, for example, of a CEQA exemption within a certain number of feet or inches of the highway within the area that is already disturbed. If you could make that exempt from CEQA, that would just result in tremendous savings. And again, because it's disturbed already, there's a very good argument for it. Making everybody go through that process individually, which is what we've been doing, is very costly, subject to a number of interpretations. But I think that that's an area where you could just, have some statewide emphasis. I think we can work together to also identify some other things that would really make a difference. Providing funding for electric access, whether you draw the money from cap and trade or for some places. One of the things, and Robert will definitely attest to this, is you spend time in the rural areas. There's a lot of diesel out there. There's a lot of kerosene out there. Particularly in counties like Modoc. It was as a city girl, I was very interested to see how much kerosene was being used. But then when I was looking up kerosene, kerosene is again extremely harmful to people. And as you inhale too much kerosene, it can lead to all sorts of problems. It can be associated with blindness. So I think there's a lot of things that we could do to help to address some of the backbone infrastructure problems which help to add to the costs, and then as well get together and say these are some of our priorities. Cool.
Well, thank you very much. I know you'll have to leave. So Robert, she's going to have to leave you at the table alone at some point. So okay. Don't be offended. I think you know that. So it's good to see you again. Thank you.
Likewise.
Thank you very much.
Great. See, I need to pull up. Let's see. Is this all set up to? Okay, let me just move over here then.
Yeah, exit to the desktop and you'll be able to pull it up that way.
Is this thing set up to?